All right. Well, I'm delighted to introduce David Schneer. David is the Louis P. Singer Chair in Jewish History and also runs the Jewish Studies program at the University of Colorado Boulder. And David is here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to talk about his book on Soviet Jewish photographers. And he actually just gave a wonderful talk on this topic last night.
Thank you.
So, David, I just want to start by asking a question about the medium that you had to work with for this project, because this is the first project that centers on a visual medium for you.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, absolutely.
So what were the kinds of challenges that you faced and obviously overcame in working on photography?
I hope I overcame. I mean, working on visual culture was a radically new way of thinking about the source base that I was trying to tell historical narratives from. So the first book that I did, I used mostly poetry, literature, and traditional archival materials produced by institutions. And the first time I realized that I was going to be working with photography, with images, I realized I actually needed to learn a whole new language, a whole new way of thinking about interpreting materials. So I basically did a crash course in art history and in visual culture and learned how to read images, sat in on art history classes, and actually really relied on the mentorship of art history colleagues to help me think about an image and how an image can do things different than a text can, how we should be approaching images different than texts. So it was, frankly, for me, it was a really fun process because it felt like getting to be back in graduate school again, really learning a whole new field and a whole new language for talking about materials.
Great. Yeah, I had a feeling that you probably had to work with other colleagues to get a sense of the language.
Which is the way good scholarship, I think, is always generated. It's always in dialogue with people who may know more about A or B issue than the person actually putting it all together to write the book. So I definitely experienced that with this project.
Great. So my other question is, for people who didn't get to hear your wonderful talk yesterday, could you just briefly sum up why looking at Soviet Jewish photographers enriches, but also, as you suggested, nuances our understanding of how World War II and particularly Nazi atrocities were documented?
Yeah, what was interesting about this particular project was I came at it through the back door. So I initially learned of the fact that the photographers who photographed World War II in the Soviet Union were Jewish. And that was the starting point for the project. And actually only after beginning the research did it sort of dawn on me the obviousness of the fact that these guys are going to be the first people photographing the Holocaust, because they are in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union where the Holocaust is taking place. So I came at that through the back door, and it was actually really great that I did, because I didn't come in with the preconceived notion of I'm expecting to find Holocaust photography, canonical images of camps or trains or survivors. And about a year into the project, when I actually got a fellowship to work at the Holocaust Museum, and in fact I had never even intended to apply to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's fellowship program, but several people sort of again pointed out the obviousness that this would be a great way to make a contribution to the scholarship in thinking about what the Holocaust looks like. And I got there actually to the museum, and they had very few images taken by Soviet photographers in their collection. So I actually ended up working with the museum to actually increase their collections of the material that I was working on my sort of several trips that I did to Moscow while I was in residence in Washington, D.C. But what I ended up discovering was a radically different image, a different landscape of the Holocaust. So rather than camps, trains, barracks, because that's not actually how the history of the Holocaust unfolded in the Soviet Union, there were photographs of empty landscapes that when I first came across these images, I literally did not know what I was looking at, which reminded me that neither did the people who first arrived at these sites. And only when they started interviewing people and digging in the ground did they discover that the Ukraine and all of Soviet Union is literally littered with sites of the Holocaust, every single town. So it was much more a localized story. It really affected people on the ground in the Soviet Union, the Holocaust did. And the photographs tell that story, as you see residents, for example, watching the exhumation of these sites that are literally their backyards where their kids were playing.
Yeah, definitely. So you touched a little bit on this issue last night, but it's this issue of Jewishness as a kind of stumbling block. So scholars who work on Soviet Jews often have to confront that Soviet Jewish writers don't want to be identified. Writers or artists or translators don't want to be identified as Jewish. They don't want to be reduced to that category because it was imposed from without in the Soviet Union.
Right.
And so how do you deal with this ethical dilemma of whether to call them Jewish or not?
Right. I mean, for me, the dilemma is not as much ethical as it is conceptual in taking a category that I'm imposing on a different historical time when the category A might have meant radically different things, and B might not have resonated as a scholarly category the way it does now. I mean, these people that I'm studying are operating in a universe where there's really no such thing as Jewish studies. What I like to think about when I use that category Jewish, or the adjective Jewish, is what new things do we learn by exposing whatever's under study to this lens of Jewishness, whether it's social history, which is the way I approach it, whether some have argued that there's aesthetics, new aesthetic questions can be raised by asking about the Jewishness of things. That's not my particular interest. My interest is in the social history of a group of people who called themselves and others called Jews, and how they end up doing particular professions, in this case photography, but it's not just photography, how that social history happens. But the issue of externally imposed identities is not particularly Soviet. I'm thinking, actually, in terms of responding to that question that I obviously had to answer, why do you care to put the Jewish lens on this story at all? I didn't rely on people who work in the Soviet Union as much as I did on people who work on American Jewish culture, who wrestle with these same issues when most American Jewish writers, they don't want to be put into the category of Jewish writer. They think it limiting, parochial. I mean, there's many adjectives one could come up with. And I found the scholarly and theoretical literature on how scholars have wrestled with putting a Jewish lens on American culture. So in particular, things like musical theater, which doesn't have anything Jewish about the theater, and yet it was being produced by Jews. And the question is why. And I found work there very helpful in thinking about that category when I applied it in the Soviet Union.
Great. So I'm just wondering, because I know you've given this talk quite a few times, I'm wondering if you had any ex-Soviet Jews in your audience and how they've responded to this, just because there's been, historically there's been very little representation of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, because as you said yourself, it's been portrayed as the Great Patriotic War.
Correct.
And so, how are ex-Soviets responding to your project?
I want to answer two questions that you probably didn't even realize you were asking too. One is how the Holocaust in the Soviet Union was actually considered part of the war. So it wasn't actually marked out as a separate story about Jewish persecution that we call the Holocaust.
Exactly.
But one of the very first exposures I had to this project was in the Great Patriotic War Memorial in Moscow. Huge complex at a place called Victory Park. And they had a museum exhibition up of one of the photographers I ended up writing about, Markov Greenberg. So he's got a last name Greenberg, and so he's obviously marked in Russian culture as someone who's Jewish, someone who's not classically quote-unquote Russian, Ruski. And I walk in, and literally the first image that this is a Patriotic War Memorial Museum has on the wall is a photograph from Shturov, the concentration camp, which Markov Greenberg, photographed May 9th, 1945, right at the end of the war, right as the war was ending. And so his photographs of Shturov didn't get published immediately because they weren't needed necessarily for their original purposes. But the fact that the Soviet Patriotic War Museum put the lens I would have put on that photograph of Shturov was a Holocaust photograph. The fact that in the Soviet Union, and this is, by the way, in 2003, so this is not actually the Soviet Union, this is contemporary Russia, had so incorporated the story we call the Holocaust into its own national narrative that for me everything just got very complicated in thinking about what the Holocaust means in the Soviet Union and how those images actually penetrate society but are never marked as anything particularly Jewish in the way to think about them. So, I mean, that's not the question you were asking. So about people in the audiences. So there are almost always people who were from the former Soviet Union in the audiences. And what's interesting to me is the generational conversation that happens. So people who actually are old enough to either have lived in or in a few cases fought in, which is now rarer and rarer, but fought in World War II. In general, by the way, people are very happy when they see what I'm doing. I was very nervous making sure that I wasn't putting my sort of American identity politics-driven categories onto a story that didn't resonate for people. But I've done it in a way that does resonate for people who see their stories represented, not for the first time, but not often enough in the work that I'm doing and in the photographs that I'm showing. So they get very proud and they get very happy. And there's usually some correction about, I was there, and actually here's what happened. And I love that. And anybody who works on anything having to do with the war and the Holocaust knows that someone in the audience will invariably have been there and point out to you why you didn't get it quite right. And so I'm happy to engage at that level of conversation. But the children and the grandchildren actually have quite interesting responses to it. Frequently, they actually hadn't seen their grandparents or parents light up in quite the way that they do when they see these images. When effectively I, a scholar, am giving, I don't want to use the word validity, but I'm elevating their personal story to the level of important narrative to the world. Of history. And for them, so my goal is, again, I hope that the exhibition that I curate around this stuff is not replicating a sort of glorious Soviet narrative of World War II, but the images, frankly, they tend towards that. But it's really about how you frame those same images. So I don't try to glorify what the Soviet Union did during World War II, but that doesn't mean that people in the audience don't necessarily see what they want to see in the images that I'm showing, no matter what I say about them. So it actually works quite well to use a lot of photography in my talks, so that people can reflect on the images how they want to.
Yeah, definitely. So my last question is just, could you give us a preview of your future project?
Sure. So the project I'm working on now takes me from Russia to communist East Berlin. And it all started as most great, at least the projects that I work on, great or not, they tend to start over a glass of wine and a great meal. And this project started in a Berlin artist loft when I learned of the story of a woman named Levantovskaya, who was a Dutch Jewish cabaret singer in the pre-war period in the 1930s, who gets caught up in the war and the Holocaust. And she's also a communist. And long story short, she ends up moving to East Berlin with her communist German husband and becomes the Yiddish, the word I use for her is Yiddish diva, because she performs on stages around the world. And as the story came to me she was the star of Yiddish theater in East Germany, which was already to me an oxymoron, at least in my head. I had never thought of East Germany as the kind of place that would be supporting Yiddish culture, unlike places that actually had Yiddish speakers, like Poland or the Soviet Union. East Germany didn't have a lot of Yiddish speakers, so it was a curiosity to me for that sake. And then she says to me, and she was singing Yiddish in Pyongyang, in North Korea, in Indonesia, and in India. And it was at that moment where I said, okay, either this is just not true. Like, come on, that's just ridiculous. Or there was some story, which is what I'm ending up working on now, of how Yiddish culture got enmeshed in the Cold War. And so that's really what I'm working on, is Yiddish after. So I'm interested in her life story, Lenyaldati, because her life story is mind-blowing. Literally, I did not believe what I was being told when I learned of her story. So I'm using her story to talk about how Yiddish functioned in this global battle between fascism starting in 1933 and ending in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So about how Yiddish music functioned in that ideological battle.
Sounds wonderful.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate it.